So the Cedar Foundation is a foundation that is around educator development, and so it's around accountability, and so that's more of that prep programs. And then we have the Council for Exceptional Children, who have special education standards. And so around those standards, that's how this work came about. It was, thinking about what are those high leverage practices. So when we look at the standards, the CEC standards for special educators, and then those practices that they need to know, that's why they created this tool for us to use. And so this particular one is to help school leaders. And it's important, again, like I said, for coaching and helping them along their professional development and supporting them throughout the school year. For those of you that were able to kind of preview that tool that I shared with you on Friday, that the digital copy of the high leverage practices, you may have already been able to go back and look through that and see that it's really broken down into 4 components. It's around collaboration, and then assessment, social and emotional, and then instruction. So for today, we may move a little more quickly through the collaboration piece because I'd like to spend some time talking about assessment and the social, emotional, and behavioral supports, and then the instruction. So as we move through, we'll kind of move a little more quickly through that part. But if you have any questions or comments at any time, just feel free to stop me. This PowerPoint will be uploaded in that Google Drive, and then I can email you that as well, because there's some links that I want you guys to be able to view from this PowerPoint presentation as we move through this one. It's just some resources and supports along the way. But let's take a look, Dan, if you'll click to the next slide then, please. And let's talk about those first 3. So there are 22 high leverage practices. And those high leverage practices are broken down into those 4 areas. And so the first 3 are under the component of collaboration. And under collaboration, this one is just talking about those 3. That's collaborating with professionals, organizing and facilitating effective meetings, and that is collaborating with both the families and other professionals. And then how we work with professionals like related service providers. We may work with community mental health folks, but how do we work with those folks in order to make sure that we have the services that students need? So if you don't mind, Danny, please click to that next slide. So the first practice, high leverage practice, is talking about how we collaborate with professionals to increase student success. And so part of that collaboration is with our colleagues at school, and that might include co-teaching and also paraprofessionals. But we also have other folks that we work with. Like I said, we have some folks that we have like besides, we have related service providers. Sometimes we have school-based nurses that we collaborate with, or because we have students that have medication, we have related service. We have occupational therapists or physical therapists that we collaborate with. So that's really around just that we support new teachers, and that those practices are that we focus on that collaboration. So the high leverage practice number 2 is really about that special education teacher being able to facilitate and lead IEP team meetings. And so they have to have knowledge about evaluations. They have to be able to look at a student's strengths and weaknesses, areas of concern, and be able to use that information to develop a goal for a student, and then decide what kind of services this child might need and how we place them, what accommodations and modifications. And again, the special ed teacher needs to be the facilitator of that learning. Okay, Danny. And then the third one is around just communicating and working with teachers and families. Now, recently we have developed a micro-credential around those collaborative partnerships, and how we have special ed teachers who can collaborate with like a hearing impaired teacher, for instance. And so there's a micro-credential around that, around those high leverage practices in collaboration. So that one's something that's just recently happened here at KBEC, but that one is a good tool. But it is good that our educators understand those how important those collaborations are. Okay, Dan, if you'll go up to the next slide, please. And like I said, we're going to spend a little more time here in the assessment and the social emotional, and then in the instruction. So an assessment has 3 high leverage practices. And the number 4 is around data and using multiple sources of information. Number 5 is how we communicate those, how we interpret and communicate those, and then how we use that data. So let's take a look then at high leverage practice number 4 specifically. So this one is really that high leverage practice here is that we want teachers to use multiple sources of information. So understanding both formal and informal assessment is a critical role for a special education teacher. And we know this if we think about that continuous improvement cycle of teaching and learning, and it's particularly important for students with disabilities because we have diagnostic assessments, we have some formal assessments, we may have, like the Woodcock-Johnson or the WISC, we have some adaptive scales. So we have all of these formal assessments that we use to identify the eligibility for a student with a disability. But we have to be able to not only understand and interpret that data, but we also have to be able to use that informal assessment. So how are teachers using not just that data, but they also have to use data from, maybe they have some map assessments, or they use even more assessment to drill down assessments like some screeners. And so the role of the special educator is really to take that diagnostic assessments and all of these pieces of informal assessment, we may even have anecdotal notes, and be able to use that to compile kind of a profile for a student. And so this is kind of just gives you an example. It's that continuous cycle that we use. We look at what kind of data that we have, and we try to figure out what's missing. If there's any pieces of data that's missing, we may have diagnostic data, but that data doesn't have some informal data, or we don't know really, we can't drill down and know what a reading level or a grade level a kid might be on. So we use that, and then we collect that information, and that's how we use that to personalize instruction.
Dion, I might add right here that, when you are in the classroom and you have high levels of engagement, and you are providing opportunities for students to practice, you should have informal assessment going on almost continuously. And that provides you with a lot of data for decision making and where the child needs to go next.
Really around that was just talking about that role of a special educator. And again, we're just kind of clarifying what that role is for that special education teacher. And reason we're doing that is just so, again, we can help you to support that special ed teacher and really clearly understand and kind of define what that role is. So around this next practice, number 5, it's around, what's the purpose of our assessment information? Why do we use that? And then what's that role of that special educator in that process? And so we'd have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that says, part of deciding if a student has a disability, they have to meet these eligibility requirements. And through that, we have, those federal regulations. And so we make those decisions about eligibility, and then we use that to make, then we define where kids' present level of performance is at, so that we know how to meet that individual student and then move them forward. And in that process, the special ed teacher really should be able to interpret the results of an assessment, and then they have to be able to communicate that assessment results to the IEP team, and to the general ed teachers, and you as ARC chairpersons, administrators, and then also with parents and caregivers. So really that's the role of in assessment for a special ed teacher, is to really understand that assessment that really gives us a picture of that student, and then be able to transfer that in. Then we're going to create like this profile, and then transfer that into writing a goal for a student with a disability.
That's one of the things that we see when we review files across the region, and we would encourage administrators to make sure that you're checking the present level's performance to see that the baseline is well established around these discrete skills. And that really gives you measurable statements in your present levels, and you work with measurable verbs, behaviors that you can see, that you can hear, that you can count, you can time. And when you look at that baseline, then that gives you a good starting point and a good foundation to your present level and to your IEP. And it really drives your special design instruction decisions and what you can do for students in terms of trying to close that gap between expected similar age performance and exactly where they are. And that's really where you come into seeing that adverse effect on their educational performance and how their disabilities playing in there.
So now we'll take a look at high leverage practice number 6. And again, you'll see this graphic here that just talks about that continuous cycle that we can use students present level. We set a goal for them. We choose what interventions and instruction would support the learning of that goal and support student learning. We monitor the progress. We look at that. It's the same thing as that continuous teaching and learning cycle that we use all the time. But helping teachers and special educators to understand that around the IEP goals and objectives. Sometimes it's a little different than that instruction, that day-to-day instruction that we see every day in terms of monitoring an IEP goal. Now, students are still expected to participate in that, be exposed and participate in that general education instruction and the curriculum. But we're talking about looking specifically at that IEP goal and how, because teachers sometimes need some support around thinking about how do they integrate that in, how do they figure out what that child might need, and then how does that work in collaboration with what's going on in the general ed classroom. How do we monitor that? But this gives them that idea or that framework for that continuous improvement cycle. Again, this is around thinking about that in terms of a student's an individual student. And so we think about that because we may have 20 kids on a caseload, that we may have 20 different students who have individual needs, that we are doing this continuous cycle of improvement for them as we think through that goal.
Dion, I was going to add too, I'm glad you have the slide that you do there with set an ambitious goal. We're operating now under the Raleigh implication of the Raleigh case, and that has also led to just recently the Andrew F. case, which has pushed us to really consider the unique circumstances of each child and to set ambitious goals for those children and really meet them where they are in light of their unique circumstances, that we have an individualized plan. And one of the things that we see, and one of the things that we would encourage administrators to do, is you're looking through your plans and you're overseeing the ARC meetings, that you would certainly be looking to see that those goals are, while they're rooted in the standards, they're not just a repeat of the standards, and they are certainly unique to that particular student's unique circumstances. So, and that the goals are challenging in view of where they are. You wouldn't want to have a caseload with 15 students and have every goal exactly the same. You have to be careful not to copy and paste standard language into those goals, and make sure that those goals are challenging for each student and effective in meeting them where they are.
So that kind of just took us through those high leverage practices around assessment. And it's really just to synthesize that, it's just really about special educators need to use data, formal and informal data, to make decisions about where a child is performing at, and then how you monitor that progress. So that's all that continuous improvement cycle. So then let's go to talking about the social emotional. And I think that's something that's going to be very, very important for us upcoming, because I think we're going to have more conversations around that social, emotional, and behavioral supports for students, especially in light of where we have been with COVID, and as we are thinking about coming back, how we're going to re-enter school and supporting that. But so we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about that social emotional learning, just looking at those classroom learning environments, how we provide feedback, how we teach students those things, and then how we do assessments around behavior to support our students with disabilities. So around high leverage practice number 7, that one, we want to look at those consistent, organized, and respectful learning environments. And so really that's around those two things, which is classroom expectations and classroom procedures. And just to share with you, we have a new and emerging special education teacher cadre that we do each month here at KVEC to support those new special educators, or those educators that's 5 years or less. And so our May meeting was around the first days of school, in the work around Harry Wong and the effective teacher. And so we had 25 participants or so, and they were all really engaged around understanding how to build those classroom expectations and classroom procedures. So even though they'd worked through this year and some of them were very, new, this was their first year, there were lots and lots of questions around how do you establish those procedures and those expectations. And Denny, can you click on that first days of school link there? Do you see it there in blue? See if that will work for you to share with us. But so these are some resources, and you will have this PowerPoint with the links as well, so that you can share this with your teachers. And you can use this, if you're working with special ed teachers, they can use some of this work in their PLCs also, just to help them grow professionally. Because I think that's another thing, is that if we can have some real tailored or specific things to support special ed teachers, but these are really good practices for all teachers. The other thing around the social emotional is just feedback for students. And so thinking about and supporting teachers, because if teachers come to us and they don't have the background in some of those practices, classroom management, those kinds of things, because we do have new special education teachers who have alternative means or emergency or probationary certification. And so as universities are building those programs to better meet the needs of educators, we still have some gaps, and sometimes so teachers may have some gaps. So understanding things like classroom management procedures and those kinds of things. And again, we'll share those resources with you so that you could provide those, you could share that with your teachers. Even as school goes back, and as they are working, as you're planning for this upcoming year, and thinking about some professional learning opportunities specific to special education teachers, that would be an opportunity. But it's really good stuff for all teachers. But so the biggest thing is, figuring out how those routines and procedures and how we pre-teach a lot of those skills and how we model those things that we want students to do. And then around this one, then high leverage practice number 8 is the feedback. And how do we use feedback? And so we use feedback in a way to teach students rather than as a punishment. And so that's why it's really important that we model behaviors that we want kids to exhibit. And we're talking right now, and specifically with this practice, around behavior. We want kids to be able to have some specific and positive feedback about things that are going well with their behavior, or response to how their classroom they're following procedures and that kind of thing. And then we want to have opportunities then, that because we think about that in terms of as adult learners, that we also want some professional learning opportunities that we can give feedback for teachers around those things, about how are we doing with student behavior, what supports might we need around behavior. And when we looked at regionally some of the needs for special education, behavior was a big issue for us across the region, and actually across the state. Behavior is something that we are consistently seeing. People are wanting more information about practices and procedures and strategies for dealing with behaviors, and what that looks like at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So does anyone have any specific questions or comments at this time? I'm just going to pause right there to see.
Dion, I think at Highland Turner, that is not really, we just wanted those strategies to use to be able to say for our ABRE work for our Tier 2, and have a clear path that I can share with my teachers, as far as saying, here's strategies to try for Tier 2 kids, and here's how we know that they are Tier 2 students. Mm-hmm. And then the same with Tier 3. So that's kind of where what we've had conversations around at Highland Turner.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Thank you. I think that's exactly where we're at, because that's what we hear a lot from special education teachers. This is what we're doing here. What does it look at Tier 1, and what does that look like? And then how do you know? At what point do you advance to Tier 2? What does that look like? How do you record that? Because that's really relevant also if we're thinking about our referral process, or you may have students who are in the RTI program, and it may be around behavior. So I think that's something we certainly could look some more at. We have built this Google Classroom for those of you that were able to join, with resources in there. But before we end today, I will share with you guys some resources that we have to support behavior, but we also can help with that. Doug Smith at KVEC does a good job with doing a tiered model for behavior supports that he could share with you. And then he works in conjunction with Kentucky ABRE as well. But that's a good point. Thank you. Anyone else want to talk a little bit about that around the behavior or about a need or priority need, and that kind of helps us frame up the work that we're doing, you know, to help support that.
I feel like at Allen, we've got a much better grasp on the academic side than we do the behavior side. We have more resources. We're very fluid with the process that we use, but I find ourselves, especially in our sit team meetings, you know, when we're talking about behavior, that we have hard time establishing, you know, this is level 2, this is level 3, as screeners, like a behavior screener, just resources in general. I just feel like we are mountains ahead. And, you know, we can write a behavior plan. We can implement a behavior plan. We can monitor its progress. You know, we can do those types of things, but specific strategies, I think our teachers are just lacking in strategies and resources and that confident to move the kids through the, you know, we just do it so commonly with academics, but I just see us struggling with the academic side of it. And I feel like it's that clear model and resources.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really good point. On this page, I'm afraid we might not be able to link it here, but at the bottom of this page, you'll see that there's the CASTLE, Social Emotional Learning, and that is an excellent tool. It's a resource around that social emotional learning, and it provides some insight about different levels of intervention, different skills, some resources, and I will take you to that, guys. I don't know if we can get it to work right now, but I'll show you guys that resource. But you're right. So when we finish today, I will also share with you the resource that we have on the holler here at KVEC around that, and there's links to all of those tools as well. So I'll share that with you. But you're right about that, and that helps us to think about that focus, because I think behavior is consistently an issue for people. I think you're Rachel, that we have really gotten to understand those tiered levels for the academic, but behavior is something that we and if that's something you guys would want, you know, Doug Smith does a great training, and he could even do that sometime for administrators, just helping to kind of think about that, and then put some resources and some tools that you could share with teachers to use. Because if you've got a kid that's being referred and they're not in special education program, but they're in that RTI, they're in that referral process, those kids need interventions, and we need to know what interventions to use, and then how to document that, and then to switch strategies. If something that we're using with the students not working after so many data points, we need to switch that strategy, and that would help them with that. But that's certainly something we can spend some more time on. You know, we'll do that today, and I'll put those resources in there for you guys. And then, but if there's anything you need for us at your own district as well, or at your school level, you can let us know, and we can happy to do some trainings around that too, and support that if you all need that.
Dion,
Yes.
there's a couple of free resources if these folks are interested on social and emotional learning. One is a K-6 resource called Sanford Harmony.
Yeah.
Sign up, it's free. It's got social emotional learning lessons and things like that in it that is absolutely free, no cost at all. It's pretty much scripted, tells you what you need to say, tells you what materials you need for the lesson, so forth and so on. And all those materials are embedded on that website. So it's Sanford Harmony. And then all they have to do is go in, sign up with an email address, and that, like I said, that's free. Another free resource out there that is K-12 is Overcoming Obstacles. And that one is social emotional learning, plus it also teaches communication skills, goal setting, things like that. And it's a wonderful resource as well. It's all free. It tells you what you need to do. It gives you all the resources, all the materials, all the handouts, you know, how long the lesson should take per class. So those are two free ones that I know of. So take advantage of those and go on those websites and find them out. And like you said, I think they're on the Holler site. There may be a link to one of them on a PowerPoint we did or something there. So first one was K-6 Sanford Harmony, and the second one was K-12 Overcoming Obstacles.
Doug, we used Sanford Harmony on our, when we were doing NTI days.
Yes,
we
ma'am.
did some choice boards from activities that were on there, and our students really loved those. So we implemented that last year as a trial with one grade, And
Right.
so we've made a plan to implement that with all of our students next year. So that is a great resource for those that are elementary that have the K-6. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Doug. So, yeah, both of those resources are really good. So, actually, those three. So that Castle resource, and then that Sanford Harmony, and then that Overcoming Obstacles. All of those are some of the, I guess they're ready. You know, teachers can use those. That would give them some tools for the toolbox to use for some strategies and some supports that they could use. So, thank you all for sharing with that. The next one then is around that high leverage practice number 10, and that is around those three components, really understanding that ABC model for behavior and understanding that antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And so we, understanding and developing a plan. And when we figure out what the function of a behavior is, sometimes a student may have a behavior as an avoidance, it's so the antecedent, is they want to there's a task that maybe they cannot complete, so then they have a disruptive behavior so that they're removed from the classroom. But helping teachers to understand that cycle and understanding that ABC model, and that helping so special educators then look at that function of the behavior, and then that's how we develop those behavior support plans. And so the important thing about that one is that just understanding that process and knowing how to collect data on that. And especially if you are intervening with a behavior that, you may have a more frequent occurrence before it diminishes as well. And just helping teachers really understand that cycle of that ABC model and when to give intervention or when to provide opportunities for intervention and how to address those behaviors. Doug, do you have anything I could add on that slide?
No, I think you covered it all. Just you got to keep in mind though, when you're working on behaviors and trying to do a behavior plan or whatever, you always want to start with the behavior of concern, and then you look at what are some antecedents, what are some things or triggers that set that behavior off, and then what are the consequences, or how do you respond to that behavior. And when you're identifying a behavior to work on as far as doing a behavior plan, you have to make sure that that behavior is defined in a way that's measurable, observable, and objective. We can all count how many times little Johnny says a bad word. We can all agree on what that word is, and that's not an appropriate use of that word. And it has to be something that someone as a stranger can walk into that classroom and observe that kid and say, yes, that is the behavior of concern that we're looking for. So make sure you define those behaviors to the point where there's no question that that's the behavior that's causing the difficulty in the classroom. And then the hardest part about doing an FBA or functional behavior assessment is gathering the data and the information from everyone that works with works with the kids, because a lot of times we leave that up to one person or one teacher to do that, and a lot of times it's a special ed teacher, and they only have them for maybe an hour and a half at the most a day. So it's difficult for them to gather that information just themselves. So it's a team effort when you're doing an FBA and writing a behavior support plan. So, and then behavior support plans, they're a living document. They can change, because if you implement a strategy and it doesn't work, don't keep doing it. Try something new. So just keep that in mind. So.
Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of the behavior. And I think so far that discussion that you guys have contributed is certainly very beneficial. And really, if we think about that in terms of high leverage practices and what a special educator needs to do, we want to make sure that special ed teachers really understand this process and they have the resources and the tools they need to provide those interventions and supports for students. But
later today, Dion, we're going to talk about the manifestation determination and some of the legal aspects of discipline around the behaviors that we see with students with disabilities. So that's coming up this afternoon, and we'll dive deeper into some of the things that we've learned around what our responsibilities and our legal authority is in that realm.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Danny. So the next 11 through 22 high leverage practices are all around instruction. And so that's what I wanted to kind of spend the next little bit talking about, is the instructional component of that. And this one, we're talking about prioritizing short-term and long-term goals. And the thing around this one is it's going to be critically important that we understand now that we may have gaps with instruction because we've missed, if students have missed some instruction, been with the COVID, but not only are we going to have to look at that content, but we're also going to have to look at those IEP goals and think about how we're going to move students. So we're already challenged to think about when we think about a student with disability, that we have to expose them to grade level content. But we also have to be able to look at that content and discern what are those critical components of that standard or that academic target, and how do we backward design that to meet students where they're at. So you may have a 4th grade standard and a student that's reading on a 1st grade level. So we already have to figure out how we're going to prioritize what that skill is. And that's going to be something that's going to be even more important now in the current situation. And so how do we do that? And so teachers might need some support and some coaching around that, because if you think about in terms of reading, you may get a diagnostic report back that gives a report on a student about their reading. They may be reading on grade 2.1 and they have a specific learning disability in reading and they're in the 8th grade. So we have to figure out how we're going to bridge those gaps as best that we can, and in a reasonable goal for that student to work on. So we know that students are still going to be assessed if they're in the 8th grade at that 8th grade level. So we have to really be able to pull that critical content out, and that's what makes it so difficult. And for special education is you really have to go back and look at that. You can use that. You could use the progressions with the standard and think about it in that way. But we also have, teachers need those to be able to use screeners, other sources of data to really drill down and see if it's a reading comprehension deficit and we're just working on fluency or vocabulary, but that's really not the deficit skill. We don't know that unless we really drill down and use maybe a screener and figure out what that exact deficit is, and then we do some really explicit teaching on that. So this one is a big priority, is how do we figure out what that standard is and looking at that standard and then backward design that to meet the need of that individual student and move them forward as far as we can. And so that's where we start that differentiation process. And so I think for special ed teachers, I tell them, that using the progression document is a really good tool, because we still are developing standards-based IEP goals and objectives. So we want them to not just copy and paste the standard, but we want to look at what skills are in that standard, and then how to figure out what those skills are and then write their goals around those, because that's what kids really need. And again, you may have 20 kids that are students with disabilities that are on your caseload. And so that will be individualized for each of those 20 kids. The other thing is, like, you may have a student, we identify kids sometimes with a specific learning disability, or they have a deficit in written expression. But do we really know what that deficit is? Is it in the writing process? Is it that they have the deficit in the planning, or do they know how to plan or revise or edit? Is it a deficit? Is it an error? So what we have to really know, so it's not just to say they have a deficit in written expression, but we need to know what is it in that writing process or in the pre-writing that the student would need in order for us to be able to design goals and objectives around that specific deficit in order to move that student. Again, if we're spending time working on in written expression and it's around planning or pre-writing, and we're working on writing fluency, we're not getting at what they need to be getting at. And so teachers need some support sometimes with that understanding, really drilling down to that, really that skill deficit. And so that's, again, why that is one of those high leverage practices, is really finding tools. So it's kind of like teachers are going to have a toolbox full of tools that they can use for different areas. Like you would have some specific strategies that you might use to teach phonemic awareness, or you may have some very specific skills that you use to teach fluency. And John O'Connor, who authored this book, Great Instruction, Great Achievement, and it's the roadmap for special education administrators. One of the things he talks about is that we have these toolboxes full of strategies for phonemic awareness, for vocabulary instruction, so that we know that these are high leverage practices that we know that help students the most. So we really know what those skills and strategies are to focus on, and then we use those for students so that we kind of build that box of tools. Does anybody have any comments or questions about that? Or how do you think how do we think in terms of special education? Do you think that special ed teachers have tools and resources they need to be able to drill down to those skills?
Dion, this is Lori Bricken, principal at Prestonsburg High School. And I just want to thank you for how succinctly you stated all of that, because this is something we really struggle with at the high school level, because we have teachers that may not feel real confident in certain content areas, especially science. And so I just thank you for clarifying that, and appreciate that. And that is probably something at the high school level, especially in the science, or maybe for us, not as much in math areas, but I'm sure probably other schools it may be math areas, that would help us if we had a little more support in those areas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it really is just looking at, it's the same kind of idea, is that backward design, looking at that standard, that science standard, and thinking about what gaps do they have? And it could be, can they apply the scientific method, or do they have a tool or a strategy that they can use? They may, a graphic organizer, or what kind of supports might it be? But you're right, that it could be a vocabulary also, especially for students with disabilities, because of the deficit that we have with vocabulary. And they just getting access to that general ed curriculum, they can't always access it because they're hung up on the vocabulary. And it may be something as pre-teaching the vocabulary, and then using models and using visual supports and those kinds of things. But I think that's a very good point, that if we know what to look for, and then if we had a few tools that we knew were effective, then you could pull those tools out and strategies out to work with students.
Yeah, O'Connor talks a lot about helping your special education teachers develop those preloaded tools in their toolbox, and being able to have a really strong conversation with parents. If the parent were to come in and ask, what is it that you're doing with my student that's so different? What is specially designed instruction? That you would have good answers for that around each particular student that you're working with.
Okay, so if we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's something we can certainly look at in terms of, and that would help all students. It's not just our special ed students, but if you can really prioritize what those skills are, that helps all of our kids, because we do have kids that that are they don't really meet that disability category, but they may have they have a processing speed issue, or they have that IQ on the low end of that average IQ that really causes them to struggle through that content, but they don't have those services. So being able to prioritize those skills and then figuring out some strategies for that really would help all kids. It would even help kids that, that normally do okay, but there's certain areas that they kind of get stuck on. So, but that's a good point. And so this one is, how do we do that how do we systematically design that instruction toward that goal? And so again, that's thinking about that in terms of that individual student goal. But we want to think about it so it's individualized, but we have to have a clear criteria for that. So if it's an IEP goal, we want to know exactly what does that mean to demonstrate mastery of that particular skill. And that may be that it's through you know, that they model that through, you know, out of time trials or out of assessments. But it's something that we identify very clear that this is what we want them to be able to do. And this is the criteria that says, yes, they've mastered it or they've not mastered it. And that's when it has observable and measurable, and then it's a positive goal. It's you know, what the student's going to be able to do, but it has to be linked to that general curriculum. So we don't want to just a goal, like I said, we don't want just a you know, if a student has a deficit in reading, and we don't want just a vocabulary goal to be a vocabulary goal, but why do we need that vocabulary? Well, that vocabulary is going to support that comprehension. And that's what we say with Standard 10, that students are going to read and comprehend text on their grade level band with that complexity. So we want all of the goals that we're writing to be connected to something with that general curriculum. So if it's, you know, whatever it is that they're working on, if it's math, if it's science, if it's social studies, we want those goals to be applicable for those. Anybody have any comments about that or thinking about that? So we really need those goals to be connected to what it is that that expectation that we have for all students. And then how is that specific for our students with disabilities? So another thing, and this one is a real kind of, sometimes it's kind of an area where it's difficult to really understand the difference, and teachers kind of get hung up sometimes, but how do we adapt our curriculum or our materials for a specific learning goal? And so sometimes we can adapt materials, but so if you look at that second bullet, we're talking about we might adapt a task, and that means that we might simplify a task, or we might shorten the material, or we might decrease the difficulty level. If we do that, we don't want it to just stay at that simple, you know, that simplified means, because we're never going to get kids to advance forward. So for instance, and I talked with another special ed teacher, and she used this example. We were talking about if you, how we're teaching kids to use multiple choice questions, and we might start at the beginning of the year. We take away a couple of those choices, and we teach them some strategies about discerning how to kind of figure out, if you only have two choices, what the correct answer is. So maybe the first 9 weeks you're working on that, and you're teaching kids maybe just to be able to discern how a strategy for, you know, choosing the right answer. But by Christmas, you're going to have, you know, 2 or 3 choices, or maybe by the spring, you're going to have 4 choices. But that we always have to have a plan, even for students with disabilities. We also always have to have a plan, or how we're going to take away that adaptation or that modification, so that we can get them to more independent level. So by the end of the year, you don't want kids just having 2 choices, because by that, you know, it's not going to be that way. When you're assessed later on, you're not going to have just 2 simplified versions of that. But that's one way we could scaffold that, so we start off, you know, providing them, but we're teaching them the strategies and the skills that they need. Then we add a little bit more, and then we add a little bit more. But that's what that scaffold might look like. So when I say that about adapting the task, we just always have to have that in mind, to think about, we don't want to just leave it at that most simplistic level, because we do want to continue to challenge students, and we want to have that expectation that students will achieve at the highest level that they can. And then the other thing is around, how do we work on the content? And so a scaffold that I use and have used in the past around like guided notes. So you have some kids who have a real just have trouble, even at the middle school and high school levels particularly, but they have trouble capturing notes, or they're disorganized, or you may have kids who have other health impairment. That's one of the attributes of that disability, is that inability to organize their thinking. So guided notes might be a tool that you start out at the beginning of the year, and you give them the notes, and then you maybe just have them fill in the blank with a couple responses. But you decrease that level of support, and you give them, as you go along, you're teaching them how to do the note taking. But then the next 9 weeks, you take away some of that support that you had in the guided notes, and then you leave them a little more responsibility. And then the next time you give them that guided note framework, and then they start to capture those guided notes. And then by the end, then they hopefully that they can capture those notes on their own independently. But so you can kind of see how that gradual release would be for some of those adaptations. And that might also work for graphic organizers or using mnemonics. But we teach the kids the skills and the strategies. And they're going to have lots of opportunity for practice and repetition and to do it over and over and over. And we have to model it. And we may give them some guided notes, and then we think they're doing okay, and we take away some of those supports, and then we see that they're not ready for that. So we go back to that. But we continue to use those, but we always keep in mind that we're always pushing that student forward with that expectation. Does anybody have any comments about that or thoughts about those?
I think it's just really important, real quick, to note that students with disabilities and students that have gaps in their learning really lots of times struggle with organization. They struggle with being able to reflect on what they've learned, and just giving them all the tools that we can give to scaffold those pursuits can only make for a richer experience. And certainly we realize that students with disabilities have a real problem in just thinking about their thinking, and really picking up on how it all fits together and providing that context for them. So these things really help when it comes to that. I really love the way you set that up there, Dion.
Thank you. So then if you don't care to, I guess we better pick up the speed here. And that leads us right to the high leverage practice number 14 is around that cognitive and metacognitive strategies. So the research tells us that students with disabilities really have a deficit in that metacognitive processing. They really have trouble thinking about their own thinking. Because you'll think about a student that you've worked with, maybe that's doing a writing prompt, and they really lack that ability to plan out what they're going to pre-write. And then once they write something, they write it down, but they are not able to go back and edit it or review it, or to go back, because when they're done, right? So they have trouble thinking through that process. Same thing for comprehension. They don't think about, did I understand this? Is there, do I need to go back and reread it? Sometimes they have trouble with monitoring that. So that's why it's really important around those metacognitive strategies. Was that we just teach them some strategies. We have to figure out what their need is, teach them a strategy, and we may have to teach that and reteach it and teach it again until they really get it. But we use those by describing what that tool is or that metacognitive strategy is. We model that. So we may have to model that for kids, or special ed teachers are going to have to model what that looks like for kids, kind of like a think-a-lab. And then we have to let them practice it, and then we have to give them feedback, and then we check to see, did they get it? And then we have to see, then can they generalize that? And that's another thing that kids have trouble with disabilities. So if you teach them to use a Freyer model for vocabulary in reading, can they use that Freyer model to understand and to work through vocabulary in science, in that content science vocabulary or social studies vocabulary? So that's where kids need some support thinking about their thinking, and that's when we have to really model that. And that's one thing I think special ed teachers that would help support special ed teachers to help their own students is always being cognizant of how we model that, how we describe it, and then letting kids practice it. So I say that all the time. You tell kids that I told you that, and I showed you how to do that, but did we give kids an opportunity to use that strategy to practice it? If they messed up, do we go back and redirect that and teach that again? So that's all around that cognitive and metacognitive strategies. And here is, again, those scaffolded supports, and that's really back to what we were talking about just a minute ago about how we provide those scaffolds and those supports for students. And that as special education teachers, and as we develop those goals, and then having an IEP team, but we develop those goals for students because we have this data that tells us this is what the kid needs to be working on. But how do we plan for those scaffolds? What do we need to do? It might be that we have to pre-teach the vocabulary, or that we have to give them models or an example. So if you're talking about teaching something at the ocean, talking about the ocean, and you're teaching something around that, but a child has never seen that they've never had that experience, they don't know what that looks like. How do we do some pre-planning for some scaffolding? Do we give them how do we build that background knowledge, or how do we give them some contextual knowledge about that before we're teaching those things? So that's why our students with disabilities need those supports. And I think other kids, that benefits all kids as well. But then we use this explicit instruction model. And that's the part about I do it, and that's how we model it, and then we do it together, and then you do it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next a couple of high leverage practices. So Dean, if you don't care to, so this one is around high leverage practice number 16. It's the using the explicit instruction model. And you know, we all think about this, it's just good teaching. We did some research on this, and you know, this model's been around, the explicit instruction model, in the 70s, but it's so particularly important for our students with disabilities, because they need to see those, they need to see that modeling. And so they need to see examples and non-examples. They need to see what that looks like. They need those visual supports. And then they need that scaffold, they structure when they give them we do guided practice. Special ed kids need a lot of opportunities for that guided practice. Because what happens usually is in that part, you know, special ed kids are not going to be jumping in there and answering questions, or they're not going to be engaged in that particular content because they maybe don't have a good understanding of it. So when we think about that, that's where we really have to engage those students with disabilities a lot in that practice sessions. And then we give them an opportunity to do it independently. And sometimes we have to go back and model it again. So that's very fluid between the I do it, we do it, you do it. Sometimes you think that they have it, but then you have to go back and model it, you know, 7 more times again before they get that, you know, and give them some practice before they really get it through that explicit instruction model. And the other thing is thinking about grouping. And how do we group kids? How do we group students? And thinking if it's in it's in a collaborative classroom, how do we work with, we divide kids into small groups, or how do we, and that's what we're going to talk about. The next session is about co-teaching, but how can we use small groups for students so they can they go in and out of those groups? Or how do we use these mixed ability groups for students? And that we need flexible groups for our students sometimes, but it's really important that teachers understand we don't want just special ed kids in the same group all the time, right? Because they're never going to see what an exemplar model looks like. And traditionally that's happened is we have, you know, a group of kids, and then we have the special education group that works separately or at a table in the back of the room. And we don't really want that to happen to be most effective for our students and even our GAP students, because they need to see those exemplar models of what it looks like to do that from their peers. So helping teachers understand those flexible grouping and support that grouping, that you may have some kids that you have a small group that you're working on a specific skill. So it could be around a skill, not necessarily a grade level all the time, because they may be working with a couple of different grade levels of kids. They may have kids in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, but if I'm teaching a skill, what kids need this specific skill instruction? And so this one is around how do we get kids in that process while we're delivering that instruction to be active and engaged in the learning. Again, our special ed kids are not always engaged in that learning, so they may be misbehaving or they're doing something else because they can't understand, they don't have that content knowledge, they don't have that background knowledge, they don't have that vocabulary. So we want kids to be engaged. And so part of that work that Dr. Anita Archer has done around explicit instruction, she really divides the kinds of responses that kids have when we work with groups of kids into verbal, written, and action responses. And the theory behind that is that if we give all kids an opportunity to respond, rather than calling on one kid or the kids that always answer the questions, if we give kids an opportunity to use like choral responses or response cards, it's like the ABCD cards they can hold up or whatever, or index cards or some that we make, but we give all kids. So I ask a question and then I have all kids hold up their response card at the same time. That holds those students with disabilities accountable. So it's a part of that accountability. They have to be accountable for that learning as well. So they can't opt out. So they can't just necessarily sit back and wait for other students to answer the question. They're going to have some accountability as well. And the same thing with written responses, teachers that use whiteboards or those dry erase boards, but have all students respond. And so that's one way that we can check for understanding for the whole group, but that's particularly, we can use that as a progress monitoring tool for our students with disabilities. And a lot of times you'll find teachers that have trouble figuring out, how do I progress monitor a student? in if they're in the general ed setting. But this could be an opportunity. You could look at the number of trial responses, and then they could record that, whether kids demonstrated mastery or not. And then another way to have kids respond is thinking about an action or movement or a way to model what they know. So those are all very helpful things to think about, and it gives kids other ways to respond rather than just the traditional raising your hand and answering the question. It just really shifts that accountability for the students to put some responsibility for their learning. Does anybody have any questions at this point or want to make any comments? I'm just moving on through, but you feel free to stop me at any time. So we have this thinking about what kind of assistive technology and instructional technologies that we have. We have this model, which is the universal design for learning. And this is how we embed technology into our instruction. And so really and there's a link there. And when you get this PowerPoint, you'll be able to link to this UDL, but it's around how do we use technology to increase the students' engagement, and how do we use that in order to help them access content. It may be a reader or something that we use to let them access that grade level content. But what else, what kinds of technology do we use to let kids demonstrate their mastery? So thinking about the product that we have from assignments, can special ed kids sometimes create a PowerPoint, or could they create a video response, or could they audio record their responses to questions? So this gives teachers just some ideas about how we can use those technologies in the classroom to support students and give them a different modality for representing what they've learned. Anybody have any questions about that, or want to talk a little bit about the technology?
Dion, I was just going to say really quickly, and I know we're running short on time, but we appreciate everyone that's tuned in with us today. And when you think about universal design for learning, you want to front load that into your curriculum. You want to be thinking about using these technologies to increase the students' abilities to show and give them access and make a equitable education for all through this use. And one of the best analogies that I've ever heard about universal design for learning has to do with just simply most of you probably at some point in your life have been bowling. And, if you always bowl and you bowl the same way and you bowl a straight ball right down the middle and you do that every time, you're going to hit a few pins, but lots of times you're going to get a 7-10 split. And that's the 2 pins in the very back that are going to still be standing. They're going to really be hard to pick up on with one more ball to roll down the lane. So if you're thinking about universal design for learning in this context or with this analogy, if you would learn to use that hook and throw the ball a little differently down the lane, and you're shooting to hit that 7-10 pin each time, in your attempts to hit the 7-10 pin, you're going to pick up those students right down the middle of the lane. And so if we'll design our curriculum and design our activities and our strategies around hitting those students that are most difficult to hit, that 7-10 split in the classroom, then we're going to pick up those guys right down the middle residually. So I just want to throw that out there. And I heard that, I ran across that somewhere, and I really loved it.
Thank you, Dan. You advance our slide to the next one, please. I'm going to try to move on through these. And so this one is just talking about high leverage practice number 20 is providing intensive instruction. And what we mean by that is that we're data-based individualization. So we look at the individual data for that particular student, and then we give that specific instruction. And what I was talking, for example, if we have a student that that has a phonemic, we look at a student's reading deficit and they're not reading on grade level, but we drill down and we look at that student has a phonics. It's an issue with phonics. Maybe they don't have mastery of the 26 sounds, 26 letters or 44 sounds. Then we know exactly what to do to provide that instruction. We give that very intensive, explicit instruction on phonics. And then we monitor them. And then we use that data to make a decision about that. And then we change our instruction based on what the data tells us about that. And so really, that's really what that practice is how we use that intensive instruction to support students. If you don't care, please, Danny, to advance that one. And then the next thing is, after we have that mastery for students of some skills, then how do they generalize that? And so that's the thing. How do kids, if we teach a kid a skill or a strategy, they might use it in reading class, but can they apply that same skill or strategy to science or social studies? But also the same thing for behavior. If we teach a child that this is the way we behave in the classroom, this is our procedure for getting a pencil, or this is how we model that we're on task, do they use that same generalized behavior in across other settings? And then Danny, if you'll take us to high leverage practice number 22. This one is around, this is the last practice, but it's around positive and constructive feedback. And so feedback is critical, and especially for our students with disabilities, but for all students, and even for us as adult learners. But feedback is very, very important, and that we don't just, give feedback with a check mark, yeah, you got it right, or no, you didn't, but it's very specific, that you did a good job with this 3-step representation of how to solve this math problem. So then that feedback very immediate, but those we know is a huge support for advancing students with disabilities, that they really need that feedback, and that we give them immediate feedback so that they are, if they maybe have a misunderstanding or a misconception, then they can make a correction on that. But we also have to think about that developmental level and what's appropriate for that feedback for our students with disabilities. But if you'll click on one more slide over, we have a whole page with all of these resources around the academic components, all around the due process, all kinds of things around special ed that's new at the Holler. And you can go on the holler.org and access all of those special education resources. And those are all aligned to different components of those high leverage practices. So does anybody have any questions at this time, or some reflection about those high leverage practices? Is that something, now that we went through those, is some new learning for you, or does anybody have anything they just want to say about those?
I really like the organization of it. I feel like this is probably one of the most beneficial PowerPoints that put it all together for us to dissect for PLCs, for our special education folks. So I'm really excited about the presentation itself, because there's so many takeaways and things that you can dig in and say, oh, I can use that for that. I was making notes as we've gone through. I've been sending some text as we've gone through. So I really like this presentation because it brings it all together. And I think we can really plan some really good PLC for our special education folks. So thank you.
That is great. That's great. You guys can have the PowerPoint, so the links will be right in there too. I'll get that to you. I just had a little technical difficulty this morning getting it out, but I'll get it fixed.
And Dion, can you email those to us as well?
I sure will. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anybody else have anything they want to